Jake touched the door of the diner, startled by the jingling bell as he entered. The small restaurant was deserted, the dim light from the fluorescents casting a gloomy, quiet atmosphere. His mother, Sarah, was still staring at the bills, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "You're late." Her voice was as sharp as ever, but her eyes were tired. Jake just bowed his head, set his old, torn backpack down near the locker, and started wiping the table without being reminded. The air in the diner was filled with the smell of grease and burnt coffee, a lingering scent that was hard to wash away. "Got homework?" his mother asked, her eyes still glued to the numbers on the bill. "Yes, but it's not due until Friday," Jake replied, his voice so soft that it seemed he was afraid to worry his mother. They had enough to worry about, they couldn't add to it. At this time the shop was almost empty, with only an elderly couple sitting in the corner, occasionally raising their coffee cups to their lips. The sound of a pan sizzling from the kitchen echoed through the whispers of clinking dishes. Jake diligently cleaned, going from table to table, his small hands calloused from years of helping people. "Table 3 needs water," his mother reminded, pointing at the table with a pen in her hand. "Yes," Jake replied, quickly grabbing the water jug and walking over. The girl smiled with tired eyes, nodding her thanks. "Thank you." Jake just nodded slightly and turned back to the bar. His mother looked him up and down, her eyes sweeping over his shoes that were about to fall apart. "Your shoes are about to fall apart again," she said, her voice slightly sad. "They're still fine," Mom, Jake quickly replied, not wanting to hear more reminders about not being able to buy new things that were too luxurious. His mother sighed and quietly pushed a plate of leftover fries towards him. "Eat, you're too skinny." Jake shook his head, replying briefly, not hungry, but before she could protest, the doorbell rang. A man in a smart suit walked in, looking unfamiliar with the space, his shiny shoes and silver hair making him seem lost in another world. Jake turned to his mother, whispering, "Looks like a rich man, probably lost." "Go ask him what he needs," his mother said, not looking up. Jake walked over, took out a notebook and asked, "Can I help you?" The man looked up, a tired smile on his face, his expression seemingly having gone through a lot of hardship. "Black coffee, no sugar." Jake quickly made the coffee and placed it in front of him, suddenly realizing that his hand was shaking slightly as he held the cup. He didn't ask any more questions, having learned long ago not to bother people with things they didn't want to talk about. When his shift ended, Jake helped his mother lock up the shop. The sky outside was quiet, not a sound. He rode his bike home, the old bike creaking as the wheels turned. The cold of the night seeped into the thin fabric of his torn jacket. Their apartment had not changed, still cramped and cold. He dropped his backpack on the floor, then collapsed into the old chair, watching his mother sit at the kitchen table, staring at the bills. Jake didn't need to look to know what the papers said: final notices, unpaid bills, threats of eviction. None of this was new, just part of everyday life. "We'll get through this," his mother said, but her voice was uncertain, tired. Jake said nothing, just looked at his mother and then at the silence, the weight of his burden seeming to weigh even more heavily on his shoulders. The next day, when he stepped outside, the eviction notice was taped to the door. He crumpled the paper and stuffed it in his pocket, not wanting his mother to see it at the start of the day. At school, the kids didn't let him go. The old shoes and the mocking jokes rang out again. Jake just endured it quietly, focused on his lessons, not wanting to face them again. The day passed like that, and by the time he was on his bike back, the weight on his shoulders seemed about to break him. And then he saw it. The old Mercedes, smoke billowing from under the hood. The man from yesterday was standing next to it, holding his phone, looking worried. Jake stopped the car, his heart pounding. He could have ignored it, but something in his heart made him turn around. "Need help?" Jake called out. The man looked up, a little surprised. "My engine's broken. I called for help but no one answered." Jake glanced at the car, wondering what he could do. "Let me try." He opened the hood, not knowing what he would do, but at least he could try. And then, after a few minutes of searching, he pointed out, "It's probably a broken radiator." The man looked at him in surprise, then handed Jake a roll of duct tape. "Do you think you can fix it?" Jake chuckled, looked at his hands and started to tape the radiator. "Give it a try, maybe you can get some mileage." When he was done, the man took the bike for a test drive, and the engine started again. He turned around, smiling gratefully. "Thanks, that was really helpful." Jake just smiled quietly, not needing the compliment. "You're welcome." "You have a good heart," the man said, shaking Jake's hand. Jake just nodded and rode home. But today he felt different. For the first time in months, he felt like he was actually doing something right. Jake listened to a distant noise outside, a familiar rumble of an engine, loud enough to make everyone in the diner turn to look out the window. He stood still, heart pounding as he recognized the car. It was the old Mercedes he had repaired yesterday. The doorbell rang, snapping him back to reality. Tom Harrison entered, not just another tired customer this time. His neat figure, his shiny suit standing out in the otherwise plain space of the diner. Jake watched as Tom's eyes scanned the room, finally settling on him. "You again," Tom said, smiling softly and stepping closer to the bar. Jake sighed softly, feeling a strange sense of unease at seeing Tom standing there. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, a mixture of worry and curiosity rising in him. Tom sat down on a stool at the bar, looking at Sarah, who was watching him with suspicion. "A coffee," Tom said, then turned to Jake. "I came to see you." "Me?" Jake asked, surprised. "Why?" "Because you helped me last night," Tom replied, his voice full of respect, without asking for anything in return, which is rare these days. Sarah set the coffee cup in front of Tom, but her expression did not change. "Jake helps people all the time," she said, her voice calm, not surprised at all. "It's how he lives." Tom looked at her, then back at Jake, his eyes shining with admiration. "I don't think it's just that. Not everyone is willing to go out of their way to help others, especially at your age. Not everyone knows how to fix a radiator." Jake felt uncomfortable under Tom's gaze, and looked down. "It's just a small matter." "Not to me," Tom said, taking a sip of coffee. "And I want to give back. I own a car dealership in town, mostly luxury cars. I've been in the business for years. When I saw you last night, I saw something that not everyone has a willingness to help others without expecting anything in return." Jake didn't know what to say, just looked at his mother, who was watching the conversation from a distance. Sarah folded her arms across her chest, still not taking her eyes off Tom. "I want to offer you an opportunity," Tom continued, his voice soft. "A part-time job at my dealership. Nothing too big, just cleaning, helping out with the little things. But if you work hard, I'll make sure it leads to a real opportunity. And if you want, I'll pay for your training so you can do this for the long haul." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the shop was the hum of the coffee machine. Jake sat still, trying to process everything Tom had just said. It sounded too good to be true. "Are you serious?" Jake asked, his voice still hesitant. Tom nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Absolutely." "Then why are you doing this for me?" Jake asked, his voice low and concerned. "For someone who did it for me," Tom replied, his voice calm. "I know what it's like to start from nothing." Tom's words were a glimmer of light in Jake's heart, but were immediately cut off by his mother's voice.
"We don't need this kind of help," Sarah said firmly, her gaze cold.
Jake turned to look at his mother, surprised by her objection. "Mom, it's not charity," he said, trying to explain. "It's an opportunity." Sarah shook her head, her voice full of doubt. "Opportunities come with strings attached, they always do." Jake felt his heart sink. He knew his mother was just worried that they would be disappointed again. But what if they didn't try? "Can we talk about this later?" Jake asked, his voice soft. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then finally nodded, though the reluctance was still evident in her eyes. "Okay, but not here." Tom stood up, dropping a few coins on the bar. "I'll let you think about it," he said, turning away. "Think about my offer." As Tom walked away, the sound of the Mercedes faded down the road, but the emptiness in the diner remained. It came not just from the car, but from Jake's lingering doubt. That evening, as Jake sat across from his mother at the small kitchen table, the notice of dismissal lay between them, the bold red letters on it a harsh reminder of the reality they were facing. "Mom, we can't keep living like this," Jake said, his voice soft but determined. "You work too hard and we can't afford it." Sarah looked up, her eyes cold. "And you think a stranger will help us?" Jake looked at her, feeling uneasy. "He's not like the others. We don't have a choice anyway." Sarah looked away, her eyes tired and worried. "I don't trust him," she whispered. "But if you think this is the right decision, I won't stop you." Jake felt relieved but also worried. Although his mother did not completely agree, at least she did not oppose him, and that was enough for him to try. The next day, when Jake went to the diner, his mother did not say anything more about the previous night's story, but he knew that they were both thinking about Tom Harrison's offer. Jake didn't say much as he grabbed a piece of toast and pulled his jacket on, the chilly morning air seeping through the gaps in the old windows. He paused for a moment, his eyes flickering over to his mom, who was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped tightly around a coffee mug. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been in days. Jake's hand lingered on the doorknob, but he didn't answer right away. His thoughts were tangled, but he knew he had to leave. "No," he said, turning to face her. "But I have to try." She nodded, her face softening just a little. "Be careful." The ride to the dealership felt like it took forever. Each turn on his bike, each push of the pedal, stretched the miles out before him. When he finally arrived, Jake felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest. The building in front of him looked like something out of a magazine, sleek, modern, and surrounded by rows of shiny, expensive cars that gleamed under the bright sun. He chained his bike to a post near the entrance and stood there for a moment, feeling like an imposter. Jake, a voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Tom Harrison, the older man from the night before, was walking toward him with a friendly smile and an air of authority. He was dressed sharply in a suit, but his approach was warm, even reassuring.
"Glad you could make it," Tom said, clapping a hand on Jake's shoulder.
Yeah, thanks for having me," Jake replied, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. Tom led him inside, and Jake couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the showroom. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, and the cars looked more like art than vehicles. They passed through the showroom, and Tom introduced him to a few employees. Most of them gave polite smiles, though Jake could tell they were confused by his presence. What was a kid like him doing in a place like this? "This is where you'd start," Tom said, guiding him into a back room. It was filled with cleaning supplies, tools, and the faint smell of motor oil. "It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. You'll be washing cars, tidying up, maybe running errands, nothing too complicated." Jake nodded, relieved that the work didn't sound too different from what he'd been doing at the diner. "I can do that," he said.
Tom smiled and gave him a knowing look. "I know you can, and if you stick with it, I'll help you enroll in a technical school. You've got a real knack for fixing things. I saw that last night. With the right training, you could turn that into a career."
Jake's stomach twisted, a mix of excitement and doubt washing over him. "You really think I could do that?" Tom's expression grew serious. "I know you can. But it's up to you. No one's going to hand you anything. You've got to earn it." That night, Jake sat at the kitchen table, his mind still racing with Tom's words. His mom, Sarah, was busy cooking something that smelled faintly of canned soup. "How was it?" she asked, her voice cautious. "It was different, but I think it could be good," Jake replied, his backpack still hanging from one shoulder. Sarah eyed him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, if you think it's worth it, I'll support you. But if anything feels off, you walk away. Promise me." "I promise," Jake said, his voice steady. But inside he wasn't so sure. That night, as he lay in bed, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he could see a way out of the endless cycle of bills, stress, and exhaustion. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible. The next morning, Jake woke up with nerves buzzing through him. He pulled on his only clean pair of jeans, the ones that still had the faint smell of diner grease in the seams, and stuffed his feet into his worn-out sneakers, which were held together by a patch of duct tape. He glanced at his mom, who was at the kitchen table, nursing her coffee. "You sure about this?" she asked, not looking up. Jake zipped up his jacket. "I have to try, Mom. We can't keep going like this." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. Just keep your eyes open, okay? People like him don't do things like this for free. Jake hesitated, his chest tightening with the weight of her words, but he nodded. I will. When he arrived at the dealership, Tom was already waiting, clipboard in hand, his warm smile unmistakable. He waved Jake over, the morning light catching on the rims of his glasses. Morning, Jake. Glad you made it, Tom said, his voice full of energy. Jake's stomach churned, but he forced a smile. Yeah, me too. Tom handed him a set of cleaning supplies and pointed toward a row of cars. All right, let's get you started. These beauties need to be spotless by noon. Think you can handle it? Jake nodded. Yeah, no problem. He got to work immediately, filling a bucket with soapy water and grabbing a sponge. The first car was a sleek black sedan, its surface gleaming even under the weak morning sunlight. Jake scrubbed the hood, then moved to the wheels, making sure to get every speck of dirt. As he worked, a few employees passed by, casting him curious glances. One of them, a tall guy in a polo shirt with the dealership's logo, stopped near Jake. Hey, new kid, the guy said, smirking. You Harrison's charity project. Jake froze, his grip tightening on the sponge. He turned slowly, meeting the guy's mocking gaze. Just working, Jake said, his voice quiet. The guy laughed. Good luck with that. Jake bit his tongue, forcing himself to keep scrubbing. He couldn't let this get to him, not today. By lunchtime, Jake had cleaned 3 cars. His arms were sore, his back aching, but he took a short break on the curb, sipping from a water bottle that Tom had handed him earlier. You're doing great, Tom said, sitting down beside him. How's it feel so far? Jake lied, though he felt completely out of place. Good. Tom seemed to sense his hesitation. You know, when I started in this business, I was just like you, cleaning cars, running errands, trying to figure out where I fit in. Jake looked at him, surprised. Really? Tom nodded. Really, it wasn't easy, but I kept at it. Eventually I found my way. You will too. Jake wanted to believe him, but doubt still clung to him like the dirt he was scrubbing off the cars. Could he really make something of himself here, or was this just another false start? That night, as he collapsed into bed, Jake's body ached, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was on the edge of something real. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. The next morning he met Tom. Tom's smile was warm as he pulled a small folder from under his arm, handing it to Jake in a casual but deliberate motion. Jake took the folder slowly, almost afraid to open it. Inside, there was a neatly arranged stack of papers, on top of which was a letter with an official, bold letterhead application to Grantville Technical School. His heart skipped a beat. What was this? Don't just stand there, open it, Tom said, leaning calmly against the counter. I talked to a friend of mine in Grantville. They run one of the top automotive technology programs in the state. The application is ready. All you have to do is sign it. Jake's gaze lingered on the papers, a mix of excitement and uncertainty churning inside him. You did this for me, he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Tom nodded, his eyes sharp with purpose. I saw you work. That night you fixed my car, man. You've got real talent. With the right training, you could make a career out of it, something to prepare you for life. For a moment, Jake just stared at the papers, the weight of it all coming down on him. He wanted to feel excited, to seize the opportunity, but doubt gnawed at him. I don't know, Tom. What if I screw it up? Tom's face softened, but his gaze remained focused. He placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. Everyone makes mistakes. That's how you learn. The important part isn't avoiding mistakes, it's getting up and moving forward after you fall. Jake swallowed, his stomach churning with anticipation and determination. Okay, he said, his voice calmer now. I'll think about it. Tom grinned at him. That's all I ask. Now, let's get back to work. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of hard work. Jake moved from car to car, his hands slick with grease but his concentration good. Each car he washed felt like progress, a small victory in a day of monotonous work. By lunchtime he had washed 5 cars and was resting in the rusty shade of the garage. Still scrubbing tires, Mark's voice dripped with sarcasm as he passed. Jake didn't even look up. Yeah, he muttered, fingers still clutching the rag. Mark chuckled and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You really think Harrison's going to turn you into a car expert? Newsflash, kid people like us don't get very far in places like this. Jake clenched his jaw, a familiar anger rising in him. Probably not, he said, but at least I'm trying. What are you doing? Mark's smirk faded just for a second, but before Jake could take advantage of the silence, Tom approached, clipboard in hand. He barely noticed Mark, his attention focused entirely on Jake. Hey Jake, Tom said, his voice brisk but friendly. I need you to move some cars into the showroom. Think you can handle that? Jake's eyes widened, the weight of the task easing. You want me to drive them? Tom grinned. Just around the lot, nothing fancy, but yeah, I trust you. Jake's heart raced as he stood up quickly, anxiety rising. He grabbed the keys Tom handed him, his hands shaking slightly as he headed for the first car, a sleek red convertible that looked like it belonged in a showroom. Not like this. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. You'll be fine, Tom called, leaning out the window. Just take it easy. Jake nodded, the engine roaring under his fingertips. Taking a deep breath, he slowly drove forward, his anxiety giving way to a sense of control. He steered the convertible across the parking lot, parking neatly in the designated spot. When he stepped out, Tom was waiting, a proud smile on his face. See? I told you I could handle it, Tom said, patting him on the back. Jake couldn't help but smile back. For the first time that day, the knot in his stomach loosened, replaced by a surge of pride. Thanks, he said, the words sweeter than he'd expected. That evening when Jake got home, he placed the job applications on the kitchen table. His mother walked in as he stared at them, lost in thought. She put down her purse and glanced at the file. What's that? She asked, sitting down across from him. Jake hesitated before answering, his voice soft. It's an application to engineering school. Tom thinks I should go. Sarah frowned, her eyes skimming the letter. And he offered to pay for it, she asked, her tone skeptical. Yeah, Jake said, almost too softly. He thinks I could learn how to fix cars, make it a real job. His mother's expression darkened. My purpose is mind racing. Why can't you just trust him? Trust me. I'm trying to do something good here. Sarah watched him for a moment before speaking softly. I trust you, Jake. I just don't want you to get hurt. Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just nodded, quietly agreeing, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. The next day at the dealership, Jake brought the signed papers back to Tom, his heart beating in his chest. Here, he said, handing them over. I'm in. Tom smiled and took the folder from him. Good. You won't regret this. Jake nodded, but his stomach churned with nerves. He wasn't sure about anything anymore, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to try. The rest of the week flew by, a blur of work, school, and uncertainty. Each time Jake doubted himself, his eyes would fall on the eviction notice still taped to the fridge, a constant reminder of the stakes. He couldn't let his mother down, not now, not ever. On Friday, Tom called him into his office. The room was neat but simple, with a few framed pictures hanging on the walls. Jake sat down, his nerves on edge. I've got good news, Tom said, his voice filled with pride. Grantville accepted your application. You start in 2 weeks. Jake's eyes broadened. Really? Tom nodded. Really? And don't worry about the cost, I've got it covered. Jake didn't know what to say. His voice cracked as he whispered, Thank you. Tom's smile was warm. You earned it. But remember, this is just the beginning. The hard work starts now. Jake nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Tom said, his confidence unwavering.
That night, Jake told his mother the news. She didn't say much, but the pride in her eyes was unmistakable. For the first time in a long while, it felt like they were finally moving forward.
Jake had barely slept the night before, but he couldn't afford to let his exhaustion show. Not today. The hours were long, the work demanding, but he was getting used to it. By the time Jake finished working on the cars that morning, the clock had already crept close to noon. Wiping the grease from his hands with the back of his jeans, he made his way toward the garage where Tom was waiting. Tom, with his usual no-nonsense demeanor, was standing beside a stocky man who wore a pair of overalls so stained with grease they could have been part of the car's own history.
"This is Louis," Tom introduced, his voice brisk yet warm. "He's been with us for 15 years. Knows these cars better than anyone."
Louis, with his thick arms crossed over his chest, nodded. His face was serious, and the deep lines around his eyes hinted at a lifetime spent in the garage. "You ever worked in a garage before?" he asked Jake, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jake hesitated, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Not really," he admitted, feeling a touch of shame. "But I'm willing to learn." Louis grunted in acknowledgement, then handed Jake a wrench, his expression still unreadable. "We'll see about that." For the next few hours, Jake followed Louis through the process of repairing a sedan with a faulty ignition system. Louis's instructions were clear but blunt, and Jake found himself fumbling at first. His hands shook as he tried to follow the steps, feeling as though every movement could somehow ruin the car even more. "Relax," Louis said, noticing Jake's hesitation. His voice was no longer cold, but firm, as though trying to offer reassurance without coddling him. "You're not going to break it. Take your time." Jake nodded, trying to focus. Slowly his hands steadied, his movements becoming more sure, more deliberate. By the end of the day he had successfully installed the new ignition system, a task that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Louis gave him an approving glance as they packed up their tools.
"Not bad," Louis said gruffly. "You've got a long way to go, but you're not hopeless."
Jake grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead, feeling a small but significant wave of pride. "Thanks."
Later that evening, Jake headed straight to the technical school after his shift. The campus was small but modern, with clean hallways and classrooms that smelled faintly of new equipment. It was a stark contrast to the greasy garage, and for a moment Jake felt out of place as he took his seat at the back of the room. His notebook was open, and his pen hovered in anticipation, but the hum of the classroom and the focus of the instructor, a man with a booming voice and a thick mustache, made Jake nervous. "Welcome," the instructor boomed as he began the lecture, diving into the fundamentals of automotive diagnostics. Jake struggled to keep up, his hand cramping as he scribbled notes, trying to absorb every word.
Midway through the class, the instructor paused and suddenly turned toward Jake, catching him off guard. "Jake," he called, "can you tell us what the crankshaft does?" Jake's mind raced. He knew the answer, but the pressure of everyone staring at him made his words stick in his throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "The crankshaft. It converts linear motion to rotational motion." The instructor nodded, unfazed, but offered a reminder, "Next time, speak up a little louder." Jake sank back into his seat, a flush creeping up his neck. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He was learning, even if it didn't always feel that way. By the time Jake got home, it was well past 9 p.m., and exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He dropped his backpack onto the floor, his mom sitting in the living room, her arms crossed. "You're late," Sarah said, though her voice held more concern than anger. "Sorry," Jake mumbled, too tired to explain. "Class ran long." Sarah sighed but softened. "How was it?" "Tough," Jake admitted, sinking onto the couch beside her. "But good. I think I'm starting to get the hang of it." She smiled gently, her fingers brushing through his hair. "I'm proud of you, Jake. Just don't push yourself too hard, okay?" "I'll be fine," he assured her, even though he wasn't entirely sure. Juggling school, work, and everything else had stretched him thin, but he couldn't stop now, not when things were finally starting to change. The next few weeks followed the same grueling rhythm: mornings at the dealership, afternoons in the garage, and evenings spent at school. But Jake could feel himself improving. Louis was tough but patient, and Jake was learning quickly, his hands becoming more confident with each repair. At school, Jake began answering questions with more certainty. He stayed after class to ask the instructor for help, determined to understand every detail. It wasn't easy, but it was progress.
Then one afternoon, as Jake was finishing a repair, Tom walked in with a clipboard. "Got a minute?" he asked.
"Sure," Jake replied, setting down his tools. Tom handed Jake a sheet of paper. "We're hosting a customer appreciation event next weekend. I want you to be part of it." Jake blinked. "Me? Why?" "Because you've earned it," Tom said simply. "You've come a long way. I want people to see what you can do." Jake felt a mix of pride and nerves twist in his stomach. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Tom's gaze softened. "You are. And it's time people saw it." That evening, as Jake sat at the kitchen table filling out his homework, he thought about how much had changed. Life wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about moving forward. Slowly but surely, things were starting to fall into place. Saturday morning arrived, crisp and cold, with a buzz of activity filling the dealership lot. Balloons in bright colors danced in the wind, and a banner stretched across the entrance. Jake stood near the garage, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, unsure of what to expect. He wasn't exactly a people person, but today he was representing the garage. He wasn't about to back out. Luis approached with a toolbox in hand. "You ready for this?" he asked, his tone still gruff but friendly.
Jake shrugged, trying to hide the nervous knot in his stomach. "I guess. What exactly am I supposed to do?"
Luis smirked. "Just be useful. Answer questions. Fix things if they need fixing. Simple, right?" "Sure," Jake muttered, not feeling reassured. "Don't let anyone talk you into doing free work," Luis added with a wink.
As the day unfolded, Jake found himself answering questions, moving cars, and even helping Luis with repairs. When a man and his young son approached with a car issue, Jake took the lead. He identified the problem: a worn power steering belt, earning a smile of approval from Luis and the customer. For the first time, Jake felt like he belonged here, that he was truly contributing. By the end of the day, Tom found him near the garage, leaning against a toolbox, looking tired but satisfied. "Good work today," Tom said, his voice full of pride. "Handled that customer like a pro."
Jake grinned, his chest swelling with pride. "Thanks, it wasn't a big deal." "It was to me," Tom said firmly. "You're proving yourself, Jake. Keep it up." Jake nodded, his heart light. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. That evening, as he walked into the kitchen, Jake found his mom sitting at the table, the eviction notice still there. But this time, the stack of bills looked a little smaller. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the envelope. Jake froze. "My paycheck," he said quietly. "I was going to give it to you." Sarah stared at him for a moment before setting the envelope down. "Jake, this is more than I thought you'd make. Are you sure about this job?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, it's hard, but it's good. I'm learning a lot." She smiled softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Okay, but you have to tell me if anything changes. Promise." Jake nodded again, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Things were far from perfect, but they were getting better, slowly but surely. Jake's journey had been a whirlwind of self-discovery, filled with challenges and moments that made him question his own abilities. But with each passing day, he grew more confident in his skills, especially at the dealership where he had found both a mentor in Tom and a sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, Jake's role at the dealership evolved. He started off with simple tasks: changing oil, cleaning parts, and running errands. But soon, Luis began trusting him with more intricate repairs, and even Mark, who had never been particularly kind to him, started to ease off with the teasing. Jake noticed it, but didn't let it distract him. His focus was now on learning. One particular day, after a particularly tough class on diagnostic systems at school, Jake's instructor pulled him aside. "You're catching on faster than I expected," the instructor remarked, looking at him with newfound respect. "Have you worked with cars before this?" "Just a little," Jake admitted, "mostly at the dealership." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep at it," the instructor said, offering a rare but meaningful smile. "You've got real potential." Jake left the class that day with a sense of pride he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he felt competent. Not just good enough to survive, but truly good at something. It was a strange feeling, one that made him stand a little taller, his chest swelling with pride. A few days later, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, buried in homework, when Tom called him into his office at the dealership. The office was just as neat as usual, with framed photos of classic cars and family vacations decorating the walls. Tom sat behind his desk, a serious look on his face. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Jake," Tom began, leaning forward slightly. "You've been doing great here. I've got an opportunity I think you should consider." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "What kind of opportunity?" "There's a big conference next month in the city, one for people in the automotive industry. Dealership owners, mechanics, engineers, the whole works," Tom explained. "I think it would be a great experience for you. Get you some exposure, broaden your horizons." Jake's eyes widened. "A conference? But I've never done anything like that before. I mean, what if I mess up?" Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "That's why I'm asking you. You've been stepping out of your comfort zone every day here. This is just the next step. What do you say?" Jake hesitated for a moment, the nerves building up in his stomach. But something deep inside him whispered that this was exactly what he needed. "Okay, I'll do it." Tom grinned. "Good. I'll make the arrangements." That evening, Jake found himself reflecting on how far he had come. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about building something, about creating a future for himself. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control. The following weeks went by in a blur of hard work. Jake juggled his responsibilities at the dealership with school, and still found time to help his mom at home. There was barely any free time left, but Jake didn't mind. He was moving forward, one step at a time. Then, on a particularly busy Saturday morning, everything changed. Tom called everyone in for a weekend push, and Jake found himself back in the garage, shadowing Louise once again. But halfway through the morning, the atmosphere shifted. Tom strode into the garage, his face tense. "Louise, Jake," Tom called, summoning them over. "We've got a situation." "What's going on?" Louise asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped over. "A customer's luxury SUV broke down in the middle of the lot," Tom said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's one of our premium clients. We need to get it running by this afternoon. Can you handle it?" Louise gave a confident nod. "Of course." Tom hesitated, glancing over at Jake. "Actually, Louise, I need you on something else. Jake, I'm putting you in charge of this one." Jake froze, staring at Tom in disbelief. "Me?" Louise raised an eyebrow but said nothing, leaving Jake to process what had just happened. Tom gave him an encouraging nod. "I've seen your work. This is your chance to prove yourself." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to say no, to claim he wasn't ready, but the thought of all the effort he had put in, the long hours, the extra shifts, the studying, pushed him forward. With a deep breath, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The SUV was a sleek, expensive machine. Jake opened the hood, feeling the intense heat radiating from the engine. He grabbed a flashlight and began inspecting the components. Tom stood nearby, but gave him the space to work. "Think you can figure it out?" Tom asked, his voice quiet but intense. Jake narrowed his eyes, inspecting the radiator. "It's overheating. Probably the radiator, but I'll check the hoses and coolant levels to be sure." Tom nodded, clearly trusting him. "Take your time. Let me know if you need anything." Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Jake carefully checked every component. Sweat poured down his face, but his hands were steady. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he found a crack in one of the hoses. "Found it," Jake said, holding the damaged hose up triumphantly. Tom smiled. "Great. Think you can fix it?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, I just need a replacement hose and some clamps." Tom quickly arranged for the parts to be brought over. Jake worked quickly, his hands steady, as he replaced the damaged hose and secured everything in place. After filling the radiator with coolant and double-checking everything, he stepped back. "All done," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It should be good to go." Tom climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The car roared to life, the dashboard displaying normal temperature readings. "You did it," Tom said, clapping Jake on the back. "Nice work." As word spread through the dealership, Jake received nods of approval from his colleagues, including Mark. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. Later that day, Tom called Jake into his office once more. "Sit down, Jake," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You impressed a lot of people today. And not just because of the repair. You've been consistent, hardworking, and eager to learn. That's why I want to tell you something before I announce it to the team. We're making you an official apprentice." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Really?" Tom nodded. "You've earned it. But don't get comfortable. This is just the beginning." Jake grinned, the excitement building inside him. "I won't let you down." That night, as he sat at the dinner table, Jake shared the news with his mom. "They made me an apprentice, Mom," he said, his voice full of excitement. "It's a big step." His mom smiled softly, her eyes full of pride. "I'm proud of you, Jake. I really am." Jake looked at her, feeling a surge of hope. "This is the start of something better for us, Mom. I know it is." And as the weeks went by, Jake poured himself into his new role, learning more than ever before. Each day brought new challenges, but Jake was ready for them. At school, he started applying what he had learned in the shop, and his confidence grew even more. Luis often checked in on him, offering advice and encouragement. "You're getting good, kid," he would say, giving Jake a knowing smile. Jake would just grin, his heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving, and for the first time he felt like his future was his to shape. As the month drew to a close, Jake found himself standing on the precipice of something new. The tension of the past few weeks was still fresh in his mind, but now there was a spark of excitement. He was looking forward to the conference Tom had mentioned. It wasn't just about cars, it was about seeing the bigger picture, understanding how the whole industry worked, and where he fit into it. For the first time, Jake felt like he was part of something larger than himself, something that had the potential to shape his future in ways he'd never imagined. The crisp morning air greeted him as he stood outside the dealership, freshly pressed shirt clinging to his back. His nerves fluttered beneath his skin like an electric charge. Tom pulled up in his sleek sedan, the engine purring as it came to a stop. He rolled down the window and flashed Jake a grin. "You ready?" he asked. Jake nodded, though his hands couldn't stop fidgeting in his pockets. "Yeah, I think so." "Good," Tom said, gesturing for him to hop in. "We've got a lot to take in today." As Jake climbed into the passenger seat, the rich scent of leather filled his nostrils, a stark contrast to the familiar smell of grease and oil back at the dealership. The car's luxurious interior made him feel both out of place and exhilarated, as though the world he was used to was slipping away, and something bigger was taking shape. The drive into the city was quiet at first, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. After a while, Tom broke the silence, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. "Jake," he began, his voice thoughtful, "this conference is about more than just what's under the hood. It's about understanding how the industry works as a whole and how you fit into it. You've been doing well so far, but today I want you to start thinking about your future. What do you want to do next?" Jake stared out the window, watching the skyline of the city grow larger as they neared the convention center. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I just know I want to do something real, something that matters." Tom nodded. "That's a good start." When they arrived at the convention center, Jake was awestruck by its size. The towering glass windows reflected the morning sun, and inside, a whirlwind of activity was already unfolding. Booths lined the halls, each one showcasing cutting-edge tools and gleaming vehicles. Jake's eyes darted from one display to the next, his mind racing with possibilities. "Stay close," Tom said, guiding him through the crowd. "There's someone I want you to meet." They approached a booth where a man in his early 40s stood, exuding confidence in a sharp suit. His smile was wide and his handshake firm as Tom introduced him. "Jake, this is Peter Caldwell. He runs one of the largest service centers in the state." Peter's gaze shifted to Jake, his smile widening. "So you're the kid Tom's been talking about," he said, sizing Jake up. Heard you've got a knack for fixing things." Jake felt his cheeks redden. "I'm still learning," he said, his voice tinged with humility. "We're all still learning," Peter replied with a chuckle. "Keep it up, and you'll go far." He leaned back against the booth, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "I started just like you, sweeping floors, fixing engines on the side, and working my way up. Hard work, plenty of mistakes, and never being afraid to ask for help. That's the key. Keep moving forward." Jake's mind raced. This was real. He could do this. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new experiences: panels on automotive technology, live demonstrations of diagnostic tools, and hands-on sessions with machinery Jake had only ever seen in textbooks. With every new skill he learned, his confidence grew. By the time afternoon rolled around, Jake was exhausted, but a sense of exhilaration buzzed beneath his skin. As he and Tom sat at a small cafe inside the convention center, sipping coffee, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his world was expanding. "You've been quiet," Tom said, eyeing him over the rim of his cup. "What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated before shrugging. "I guess I'm just overwhelmed. There's so much to learn, so much I didn't even know existed." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good thing. It means you're starting to see the possibilities." Jake thought about that as he stared at his coffee. For so long, his life had been limited to the diner, school, and the constant grind just to get by. But now it felt like something bigger was within reach, a future worth working toward.